My name is Clara, and the night I nearly froze to death at 16 wasn't an accident. It was a punishment. My father threw me out into a Michigan blizzard wearing nothing but a t-shirt because I dared to question his authority. That night carved a truth into my bones deeper than the frostbite ever could. In my family, love came with terms, and respect was never one of them. I lived, but I've never been the same. And if you've ever felt like the people who were supposed to protect you became the ones who broke you, you might understand what comes next. Before I share what really happened that night and what it taught me, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. It was 13 degrees F that night, the kind of cold that made the inside of your lungs ache. And still I stood on the front porch, barefoot on snow-packed concrete, wearing nothing but a t-shirt with a faded high school logo. My hands trembled. My legs were already going numb. My teeth chattered uncontrollably. My dad's face hovered in the doorway, flushed and furious, his breath clouding in the air behind him. "You want to meddle like an adult," he sneered. "Then deal with the consequences like one." And then he shut the door. Click. That sound. That lock. I still hear it sometimes in dreams. I wish I could say I was surprised, that this was some sudden outburst from a normally loving father. But the truth is, this had been building. For years. I had learned early on that in our house, silence was safer than truth and obedience was prized above dignity. I'd heard them fighting again, Mom and Dad, about money, about Aunt Regina's will, about something I wasn't supposed to know. I didn't mean to listen, I swear. But when I asked the next morning why Aunt Regina's house was suddenly off limits, he exploded, said I was interfering in adult matters, that I needed to learn my place. Apparently that place was outside in the snow. I remember staring out at our quiet Michigan cul-de-sac. Everything looked so peaceful under the fresh snow, so innocent. Christmas lights twinkled from the neighbors' windows. Somewhere, a dog barked faintly. Inside, my mom watched from the window, unmoving. She didn't open it. She didn't wave me back in. She just watched. I think that hurt worse than the cold. Within 15 minutes, my fingers had turned stiff. I couldn't feel my ears. I kept pacing in circles, whispering through frozen lips, trying to stay awake, trying not to cry because crying made the ice bite harder. My breath fogged out into the dark. The sky above was brutally clear. I thought I might die. When the neighbors found me, I was slumped beside their garage, barely conscious. Mr. Dorman, retired Army medic, wrapped me in a coat and called 911. They said my core temp was dangerously low. I don't remember the ambulance ride. I do remember the ceiling tiles of the hospital, how bright the fluorescent lights were, how sterile the rooms smelled. I remember my mom sitting by the bed, eyes dry, arms crossed. "We warned you, Clara," she said. "You need to stop pushing." Not one apology, not one tear. Just that same message, fall in line or fall out of favor. And in that white room, wrapped in blankets, Ivy humming beside me, I realized something that still knots my stomach. I could have died and they wouldn't have cared. They would have justified it, called it a lesson, a consequence. But I didn't die. I came back colder, yes, but also sharper. They didn't know it yet, but something inside me was changing. I wasn't going to be their good little daughter anymore. I turned 18 in a town where ambition was considered a flaw. The kind of place where people smiled at you in church but sneered when you dared to want more than what was good enough. And for girls like me, girls who'd once made the mistake of believing they mattered, it was clear early on. Survival meant shrinking. After the hospital discharged me that winter, I didn't go home. My parents said I was too dramatic to be trusted, that I was lucky they even visited. But I knew the truth. What I'd experienced wasn't a one-off mistake. It was punishment disguised as parenting. So I stayed quiet, finished high school with my head down, got my diploma in June without a soul from my family in the audience. And a week later, I started working at a diner on the edge of town. The kind with cracked vinyl booths and a flickering neon sign, Rosie's Diner. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. 6 a.m. shifts taught me more than school ever did. How to refill coffee while deflecting unwanted comments. How to smile without revealing your soul. How to keep track of 10 tables and still hear the fry cook swear under his breath when we ran out of hash browns. My boss, Janie, was tough in the way only women who have survived small-town life can be. She had steel gray curls and a chain of gold rings that jingled when she counted tips. She didn't ask why I worked doubles. She just gave me the hours and said, "Keep your chin up, Clara. You pour coffee like a pro." That place became my sanctuary. While the other girls from school posted dorm selfies and homecoming photos, I scrubbed ketchup off booths and memorized regulars' orders. A man named Earl always asked for extra pickles. Ms. Loretta wanted her eggs, so runny they might just crawl off the plate. I learned people's lives through their breakfast habits, and slowly, I learned to trust the quiet. The basement room I rented wasn't much. It smelled faintly of mildew and the hot water was temperamental, but it was mine. The first space that didn't come with someone else's control. I bought cheap curtains with a sunflower print and a rug from the thrift store that didn't match anything, but it made me smile. And maybe that's where it started. The healing. Not in some dramatic moment of triumph, but in those tiny acts of reclaiming. Hanging pictures I chose. Eating cereal for dinner on the floor with a book in my lap. Going to sleep without the weight of their rules suffocating my chest. Still, sometimes at night, I'd hear my dad's voice in my head. "Don't get ahead of yourself, Clara. You're not cut out for the real world." It echoed through years of belittling, of dreams dismissed with a smirk, especially when I dared to mention college. He laughed once, said, "College for you?" So I didn't go, not because I didn't want to, but because hearing him laugh like that made something in me crumble. And that's what they wanted, wasn't it? For me to stay small, predictable, dependent. Instead, I made a different choice. Every paycheck, I tucked $20 into a mason jar labeled Freedom Fund. I told no one. I just kept working, morning shifts, night shifts, holidays, double time on Christmas when the other waitresses wanted to be with their families. Janie gave me a Christmas bonus that year. Not much, but she hugged me and said, "You deserve more than this town can give, Clara. Don't forget that." It was the first time in my life an adult said I deserved anything. I cried in the walk-in freezer just to get it out. By February, I had enough for a bus ticket and a down payment on a tiny studio in Detroit. It wasn't the city people dream about. It was messy and loud, and nothing like the quiet backroads I'd known. But it didn't smell like my father's cigars or feel like my mother's cold shoulder. The first night in my studio, I sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor, surrounded by thrift store furniture and the hum of city noise beyond the thin walls. I was alone, but not lonely. There was no one to tell me I was a failure, no one to take the heater away when they were angry. Just me, a used futon, a chipped coffee mug, and the quiet freedom of not needing to ask permission to exist. For the first time, I looked around and thought, maybe I can build something out of this. It wasn't college. It wasn't fancy. But it was the beginning of something that belonged only to me. Detroit didn't care who I used to be. That's what I liked about it. No one knew my father. No one whispered about that night in the snow. I could walk down cracked sidewalks past graffiti-covered walls and broken glass, and no one looked at me like I was broken too. In this city, everyone had scars, and no one was interested in pretending otherwise. My studio was no bigger than the kitchen I grew up in, but every inch of it felt earned. The floor creaked, the pipes groaned, and there was one window that overlooked a brick wall. But to me, it was a palace. I furnished it slowly, piece by mismatched piece. Velvet pillows from a thrift store, a second-hand bookshelf that leaned like it had secrets, a string of fairy lights that made the peeling paint feel less like decay and more like texture. It didn't matter that my mattress sat on the floor or that my coffee table was a plastic storage bin. It was mine. I didn't expect the silence to be so loud at first. After years of slamming doors and tense dinners, the absence of noise was unsettling. I'd lay in bed and hear the radiator hiss and the upstairs neighbor's footsteps like thunder. Sometimes I'd sit in my little kitchen and instinctively brace for criticism that never came. You'd be surprised how long it takes for your nervous system to stop preparing for war. But slowly, that silence became sacred, peaceful. I started lighting candles in the evening and playing old jazz records on a second-hand player. I cooked small meals for myself, just enough, just right. I'd never known the taste of food made with no one else's expectations hovering over it. And then I started writing. It wasn't planned. I didn't sit down one day and decide to bare my soul to the world. It happened one cold March night when the wind outside howled like a creature trying to claw its way in. I opened my laptop and just wrote. About that night in the snow, about the humiliation, about the silence that followed. I didn't use names, didn't point fingers, but I told the truth. I called the blog "Dust Off the Doorstep," a phrase I remembered from my grandmother's old saying. When someone shuts you out, dust off the doorstep and walk away. It felt right. I published that first post at 3:42 a.m. No one read it. But I slept better that night than I had in months. I wrote again the next day, and the next. Posts about emotional whiplash, about growing up in a home where you were both invisible and under a microscope. I wrote about feeling like an outsider in your own skin, about choosing solitude over performative connection. Slowly, people started finding it. At first, it was a handful of anonymous comments, then emails. Then a woman named Lydia from Ohio sent me a message that made my throat close up. I thought I was the only one. Thank you for putting it into words. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just writing to process. I was writing to connect, to reclaim something. I wasn't the girl in the snow anymore. I was Clara, voice clear, hands steady, holding the pen that always tried to pry away from me. I started setting a ritual. I'd light my grandmother's old lamp, one of the few heirlooms I had, and right by its soft, golden glow, I poured coffee into the chipped mug I'd bought on my first day in the city. And I told the stories that had been festering under my ribs for years. I didn't need to scream. I just needed to speak. That blog, those late-night posts, they were my rebellion, my quiet war. I wasn't asking for pity. I wasn't seeking revenge. I just wanted to be heard. And somewhere between the words and the silence, between the healing and the hurting, I found something I hadn't dared to believe in. Myself. It was a Thursday, gray and sleepy, the kind where everything feels muffled. Sound, light, even time. I had just finished a post titled "The Comfort of Cutting Ties" when there was a knock at my door. 3 soft raps. Polite, like it could be a neighbor or a delivery. It wasn't. When I opened it and saw them, my parents, standing on the front steps of my Detroit apartment, a part of me forgot how to breathe. My mother wore a pastel sweater like she was heading to brunch. My father had a grocery bag in one hand like he'd just returned from an errand. Their expressions, strangely calm. Disarming, even. "Clara," my mother said with a forced smile, like we hadn't spoken in 2 years. Like I hadn't ended up in the hospital last time we lived under the same roof. My body went cold. I didn't move, didn't speak. "We're in a bit of trouble," my father cut in. "We lost the house." There it was, the real reason, not an apology, not a moment of reckoning, just a problem they expected me to solve. I should have shut the door right then. But something in me hesitated, not because I trusted them, not because I wanted them back in my life, but because some part of me, the child in me, still longed for a version of them that didn't exist, still wanted to believe they might be different this time. So I let them in. Just for a night, I told myself. Just until they figured something out. They stepped inside like nothing had happened. My mother complimented the decor. "Very cozy, Clara," she said, as if she hadn't once mocked me for wasting money on junk. My father gave a small nod, scanning the space like he was calculating square footage. They set their bag down, asked if I had tea. They were polite, too polite, like guests auditioning for forgiveness. That night I couldn't sleep. They stayed on the futon, my futon, and I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, pulse pounding. I didn't trust their silence, didn't believe in their sudden softness. They were acting, I knew it, and I had no script for how to respond. The next morning, they were making breakfast. My mother was humming in the kitchen. My father was reading the newspaper like he'd never screamed at me, never thrown me into the cold like garbage on collection day. I watched them from the hallway, arms folded, and said, "What's the plan?" They exchanged a look. "Well," my dad said, "we were hoping we could stay here for a bit, just until we get back on our feet. No end date. No offer to pay rent, just vague timelines and old expectations." "I have a routine," I said firmly. "Boundaries, this isn't permanent." "Of course," my mother nodded, brushing imaginary dust off the counter. "We don't want to intrude." They already had. In the following weeks, their presence turned my apartment into a haunted house. At first, they played nice, complimented my cooking, asked about my blog. My mother even said she couldn't believe how mature I'd become. It felt less like praise and more like a trap, because slowly the old habits crept back in. My father began turning down the thermostat without asking. "You're wasting heat," he muttered one morning, twisting the knob. My mother started rearranging things. The dishes, my bookshelf. "It just flows better this way," she explained. I felt myself shrinking again. Every time I posted to the blog, I did it with a lump in my throat, wondering if they'd read it, if they'd recognize themselves in the words I was finally brave enough to write. One day, I came home from a shift at the diner and found them in my bedroom. They were looking through my closet. My father had my journal in his hands. I didn't even ask what they were doing. I just said, Get out of my room. We were just trying to understand you, my mother said, her voice a shade too smooth. That's not your right anymore, I replied. They didn't apologize, they never do. That night I locked my bedroom door. The blog post I wrote afterward was raw and vulnerable. I titled it When They Come Back Smiling. It went viral. Hundreds of messages poured in from people who had lived the same quiet horror, parents who returned not to make amends but to reclaim control. A week later, I received an email from an editor at a small press. They wanted to publish my writing, a book. My hands trembled as I read the message, because here it was, validation, freedom, a door I had built myself. And the first thought I had, they can't stay here anymore. It started with a hum in my chest, a vibration I couldn't explain. Something was off. It was a rainy morning, the kind that made the windows fog and the floor feel colder than it should. I was standing at the sink, rinsing my coffee mug, when my eye caught the small velvet box I always kept on the shelf beside the window. Except, it wasn't there. My grandmother's wedding ring. A simple, delicate band with 2 tiny sapphires nestled into the gold, one for her and one for my grandfather. She wore it every day until the day she died. And when I turned 16, she pressed it into my palm and whispered, "For when you need to remember where you come from, who you are." I'd kept it tucked away ever since. Too precious to wear, too symbolic to forget. Now it was gone. My hands froze under the tap. My breath held still in my chest. I didn't want to leap to conclusions, but I also didn't want to ignore the feeling twisting in my gut. I searched the shelf, the drawer, every surface it might have been moved to. Nothing. I tried to be calm, rational. Maybe I had misplaced it. Maybe I had moved it without thinking. But I hadn't. I knew that box's exact spot by heart, the way someone knows the placement of their heartbeat. I waited until they were both home. My mother was folding laundry on the futon, and my father was on his phone, scrolling aimlessly. "Have either of you seen a small ring box?" I asked, my voice neutral, almost light. My mother didn't even look up. "What ring box?" "It's velvet, blue, had a ring in it that belonged to Grandma Ellen." She blinked slowly. "Oh, that." My stomach dropped. "That," I repeated, more sharply now. "We pawned it," she said, like she was telling me the weather. "We needed some cash for groceries. Replace it once things settle down." Pawned it, just like that, like it was nothing. "Groceries," I echoed, my voice brittle. "We have food, I buy groceries." My father looked up then, frowning. "Clara, don't be dramatic, it was just sitting there collecting dust." That's when I felt it, the heat rise up my throat, that vibration in my chest finally finding its frequency. "It wasn't yours," I said quietly. "It's family," my mother said with a shrug. "What's the difference?" And there it was again. That old refrain. That suffocating justification they always leaned on, family, as if that word excused theft, silence, betrayal. As if it gave them a key to everything I had. But this wasn't a sweater. It wasn't a mug or a thermostat. This was the last piece of the only woman who had ever made me feel safe in this world. "You had no right," I said. "Clara, calm down," my father snapped. "It's just a ring." It was not just a ring. It was the only proof I had left that someone in our family loved without strings. And they sold it. For what? $20 and a loaf of bread. No apology, no remorse, just entitlement. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I went silent. That night I sat in my room in the dark. I didn't turn on the lamp. I didn't play music. I didn't open my blog. I just sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at the empty shelf where the box used to be. I thought about my grandmother's garden. The one I used to help her weed in the summers, back when her hands still worked and her laugh still echoed through the tall sunflowers. I remembered how she used to hum while planting marigolds and say, "You don't pull a flower just because it grows different than the others." And I realized something. They hadn't just taken a ring. They had taken the last tether to a woman who taught me I was worth something. And in that silence, I made a decision. No more compromising, no more bending. They had to go. I didn't speak to them for 2 full days. Not because I was sulking or dramatic or whatever word they'd spin behind my back. I stayed quiet because the anger inside me had grown roots, and I knew that if I opened my mouth, it might come out in fire. And I didn't want fire. I wanted finality. So I let them exist in the same space, cooking in my kitchen, lounging on my furniture, flipping through channels like they hadn't stolen the last sacred thing I had. I watched them pretend nothing had changed. Then I called the police. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't public. It wasn't about revenge. It was about clarity. I gathered my lease, my proof of residence, photos of the ring, even my grandmother's will where the item had been explicitly listed as a gift to me. I explained to the officers calmly that my parents had sold an heirloom without my consent, that I hadn't given permission, that I wanted them gone. The officer on the phone was kind, asked simple questions, took his time. "We'll come by this afternoon," he said. "You're doing the right thing." The right thing. That phrase settled deep in my chest, like a seed taking root. When the knock came at 3:17 p.m., my mother was folding towels and my father was making himself tea in the kitchen. I opened the door and stepped aside without a word. 2 uniformed officers walked in, one male, one female, both calm, professional, alert. The moment my father saw the badge, his posture changed. He straightened, narrowed his eyes. "What's going on?" he asked sharply. "Sir," the officer said, "we're here because of a reported theft and unauthorized occupancy." My mother let out a laugh. "Oh, Clara," she said, the edge of mockery sharp in her voice. "This is childish." But the female officer turned to her. "Ma'am, this isn't a joke. Your daughter is the legal tenant here. She's provided documentation. We're going to have to ask you both to leave the premises." The silence that followed was thick, taut as wire. "You called the police on your own parents," my father said, voice low, dangerous. "No," I said, locking eyes with him. "I called them on 2 people who stole from me and wouldn't leave my home." "We're family," my mother hissed, her voice brittle now. "Exactly," I said. "Which is why I gave you so many chances before this." There was a strange shift then, a flicker of disbelief in their eyes. Not rage, not regret, confusion, because they never thought I'd actually do it. They had always counted on my silence. But I wasn't 16 anymore, shivering on a doorstep. I was 21, standing tall in my own home, with the law on my side and no more apologies left to give. The officers allowed them to gather their things, 2 duffel bags and a few of my towels they tried to take by mistake. They muttered, glared, tried to bargain. But the female officer stood at the door, firm, unmoved. When my father turned to me for the last time, his words came out like ash. "You've always been ungrateful." And I, steady now, said, "And you've always mistaken control for love." Then the door shut behind them. And just like that, they were gone. I stood in the middle of the apartment, the silence blooming around me like smoke after a battle. It wasn't triumphant. It wasn't euphoric. It was clean. I walked to the kitchen, turned off the stove they'd left on, folded the half-done laundry, placed their tea mug in the sink. Then I sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor in the growing dusk and let the silence wash over me like a baptism. It was mine again, all of it. The air, the floor, the quiet. And for the first time in weeks, I could hear my own heartbeat without theirs pushing it off rhythm. After they left, I thought the silence would feel like triumph. Instead, it felt like space, like a clean page. The first few days were strange. I kept expecting to hear my father clearing his throat in the kitchen or my mother sighing as she reorganized something that didn't need reorganizing. But they were gone. And in their absence, my little studio felt bigger. Too big at first. I slept with a light on the first night. Not because I was scared they'd come back, but because some part of me still didn't trust peace. Not yet. But that next morning, I woke to light filtering through the blinds and something new. Something I hadn't felt in years. Calm, not relief, not celebration, just stillness. And in that stillness, I remembered the ring. My grandmother's ring. The one they pawned without so much as a second thought. That ache came back to my chest, dull but steady. So I did what I do best when the world starts spinning. I got organized. I made a list of every pawn shop within 5 miles of my apartment. Then I expanded it to 10, then 20. Every evening after work, I laced up my boots and walked the city streets. Small storefronts tucked between liquor stores and payday loan centers, bell chimes on the door, glass cases filled with forgotten treasures and lost time. "Hi," I'd say. "I'm looking for a ring. Gold band. 2 sapphires. Small. Sentimental." Most days, the answer was a polite no, or a distracted shake of the head. But I kept going. Not because I was sure I'd find it, but because I needed to try. I needed to prove to myself that I wouldn't lose her memory the way they wanted me to. 2 weeks into my search, I found myself in a narrow shop near Eastern Market. Dust hung in the air like it hadn't moved in years. The man behind the counter looked like he hadn't either. He barely glanced at me as I explained, but when I mentioned the sapphires, something flickered in his eyes. "I might have something," he murmured. My breath hitched. He pulled out a tray from beneath the counter. Old rings, tangled chains, tarnished lockets. And then there it was, tucked in the corner like it was hiding from the world. My grandmother's ring. I knew it instantly, the delicate etching on the inside of the band, the soft curve of the stones, the faint scratch near the clasp from where she once caught it on a rose bush. I reached out but stopped. "What's the price?" I asked. He shrugged. "$250, it's not real fancy." I pulled the cash from my bag without hesitation. I didn't try to bargain. I didn't blink. He slid it across the counter in a small paper envelope. I walked out of the shop with my hand clenched around it, trembling. At home, I didn't put it away. I lit a candle, played the jazz record my grandmother loved, something with horns and heartache, and sat in the glow of her old lamp. Then, slowly, I opened the envelope. The ring was colder than I remembered, but when I slid it onto my finger, it fit like it always belonged there. That night, I dreamt of her. She was kneeling in her garden, wearing those faded gloves she always used to forget she owned. The marigolds swayed behind her. She looked up at me, her face soft and strong all at once. "You did the right thing, baby girl," she said, and then I woke up. The ring was still on my hand, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel haunted. I felt protected. I wore the ring the next day, not as armor, not as a statement, as a promise, to her, to myself, to the girl who once stood barefoot in the snow and thought she'd never feel warm again. I was warm now, because I had saved something sacred. And I wasn't done yet. The first message came on a Wednesday. I was sipping coffee in the early afternoon, scrolling through comments on my latest blog post when I noticed a new email. The subject line read, "You should be ashamed." No name, no salutation, just venom. At first, I thought it was spam. I almost deleted it without reading. But curiosity pulled me in. The body of the message was short, brutal. "Your poor parents. After all they've done for you, this is how you repay them. Clearly unstable, get help." My hand froze on the mouse. I stared at the words, their harshness almost laughable in contrast to the calm of my morning. But then another one came, and another, different senders, same tone. "Ungrateful brat. Do your readers know you kicked your own mother onto the street? You think playing the victim makes you strong, it just makes you pathetic." And that's when I knew they were talking. My parents, not to me, not directly, but to anyone who would listen. I logged onto Facebook, an account I barely used anymore, and saw it there, shared by a second cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. A long, winding post from my mother. She painted a picture of a daughter influenced by toxic internet strangers, someone who twisted family struggles into abuse narratives and turned her back on the very people who raised her. She ended with a plea for prayers and a vague mention of legal action. The comments were flooded with outrage, sympathy for her, confusion, offers to reach out to Clara and help guide her back to her senses. I felt like I was reading a stranger's eulogy. They were rewriting the story, twisting it. I knew they'd try something, but I didn't expect it to feel like this, like a second exile. This time, not from a house, but from the truth. That night, they took it further. They called my publisher. I found out through an apologetic email from the editor who'd offered me the book deal. Apparently, my parents had contacted the small press directly, posing as concerned family members worried about my mental stability and warning that my manuscript contained defamatory lies. The editor was gracious. "We're still moving forward," she assured me, "but I thought you should know what's happening behind the scenes." My chest tightened, not from fear, but from something heavier, grief, because there it was again, the proof that they would rather burn down what I built than admit they hurt me. I didn't respond publicly. Instead, I opened a new document and began writing. Not a blog post, not a letter, a chapter, titled "The Silence They Couldn't Understand." It was about the weaponization of family roles, about how silence in homes like mine wasn't peace, it was oppression. It was what kept the secrets hidden, the bruises unmentioned, the betrayal palatable. I poured myself into the words, all of me. Then I posted a short entry to the blog, not naming anyone, not defending myself. Just this: when people can't control your truth, they try to control the narrative around it. But truth doesn't need validation, it just needs to be told. That post got more views than anything I'd written before. Hundreds of comments, some angry, but most supportive. Survivors, daughters, sons, people who had been told their pain was a lie simply because it made someone else uncomfortable. I read them all. Each one a reminder I wasn't alone. Still, the pressure mounted. The emails didn't stop. I started getting calls from blocked numbers, voicemails saying, "You've changed," or "Don't do this to your family," or we're just trying to help. And then came the worst one. A message posted publicly by my cousin on behalf of my parents. They claimed I'd fabricated everything, that I was mentally unwell, that I was taking advantage of people's sympathy for personal gain. They said I'd gone no contact because I was ashamed of what I'd become. They dragged out my past, old photos, childhood stories, moments I had long buried, and weaponized them. My hands shook as I read it. I could have fought back, posted my receipts, my records, the police report, the ring, but I didn't. Because if there's one thing I've learned from the snow, the silence, the theft, the screams, it's this: the truth doesn't scream. It stands, so I stood, and I stayed quiet. Not because I was afraid, but because I'd finally learned the difference between setting the record straight and giving them more of my airtime. They weren't in my home anymore, and they weren't getting back into my head. I stopped reading the comments eventually, not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much. It's easy to say you're unshakable until the world starts whispering lies in your voice, until people you haven't seen in a decade share your name like it's a rumor, or your trauma like it's an opinion to debate. But here's the thing about survival. It doesn't always look like winning. Sometimes it just looks like not quitting. So I kept writing, not to fight them, but to build something they couldn't reach. I spent early mornings and late nights at my desk, surrounded by half-empty coffee mugs and sticky notes with half-formed sentences. I turned my focus from pain to purpose. Because if my words could help one person feel less alone, that was enough. My book moved forward. Slowly at first, drafts, edits, rewrites, but every time I hit save, I felt that little knot of guilt unravel just a bit more. I was telling my story, on my terms, and no amount of family slander could take that away. Then one rainy Thursday in April, I got a call from my editor. "Clara," she said, "we're greenlighting your manuscript for publication." I blinked. "Like, actually publishing it?" "Yes," she laughed. "Actually publishing it, and there's something else. Our team loves your voice. They think you might have the heart to mentor other writers, especially trauma survivors. Would you consider starting a small imprint under the press?" My mouth went dry. I hadn't thought that far ahead. I'd barely imagined holding my own book in my hands, let alone helping others do the same. But something inside me, something small and sunlit, stirred. "Yes," I said softly. "Yes, I would." And just like that, my life shifted. I named the imprint Unspoken Bloom after a line in my grandmother's favorite poem. "Not every flower needs sunlight to bloom, some learn in shadow." I started from my home office, if you could call it that. Really, it was just the same corner desk and a few sticky notes taped to the wall. But I built a website, designed submission guidelines, reached out to survivors I'd met through the blog and said, "Tell me your story, I believe in you." And they came. Women who had left abusive marriages, teenagers writing poems from foster homes, men who had never spoken aloud about the pain of growing up unheard. I didn't change their stories. I just gave them a place to tell them. And slowly, joy trickled back into my life. Not in the loud, triumphant way movies make you expect. It was softer than that. It was the way the morning light hit my coffee mug, the way my ring caught the sun while I typed, the way I finally stopped waiting for someone to barge back in and ruin it all. Joy, I realized, isn't the opposite of pain. It's what you grow next to pain, like a flower climbing from cracked concrete. My daily life became a quiet rhythm. Mentoring, editing, writing, sipping tea while emails pinged in. I'd go for walks in the late afternoon, breathing deep, letting the city noise settle into the background. And every so often, I'd get a message from a reader. "Your words saved me. I didn't leave, but now I'm planning to. I cried reading your story. Thank you for not making me feel crazy." Each one felt like a thread, weaving a tapestry I never imagined I'd be strong enough to start. One afternoon, I looked up from my desk and saw the rain tapping against the window, the same kind of rain from the day I realized the ring was gone. But this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt like a blessing, because here I was, not just surviving, but building. I had traded screams for silence, silence for voice, voice for impact, and maybe that's what healing is: not forgetting, not forgiving when it hasn't been earned, but planting something beautiful in the place where pain once grew wild. It started with a headline. I was on hold with my printer of all things when a real estate alert pinged on my phone. "Foreclosure notice filed, Maple Creek property." I almost ignored it. Then the address caught my eye. My childhood home. The house with the brown shutters and the sloped porch that once iced over in winter. The same porch I'd stood on barefoot in a snowstorm. The same house I'd been cast out from, stripped of warmth and dignity. And now it was up for repossession. I stared at the listing for a long moment, not out of joy, not revenge, just gravity. Even homes can lose their foundations when rot runs deep enough. I clicked the details. Delinquent taxes, defaulted loans. 4 months past due. The mortgage company was cutting its losses. The next morning I called the bank, not to gloat, not to stir the past, but to inquire. The voice on the line was brisk but polite. "Yes, we are accepting offers. Would you like to schedule a viewing?" "No," I said quietly. "I already know the layout." The paperwork was clinical, numbers, signatures, approvals, but every page felt like poetry to me. I didn't tell anyone, not my editor, not my friends. I wanted no noise in my head when I made this choice, because this wasn't about possession. It was about power, about reclaiming the space where I'd first been told I was less than. And now I held the deed, in full, no mortgage, no co-signers, just my name printed clear across the bottom. Clara Elise Monroe. I ran my fingers over the ink. It was strange, surreal, how something that once symbolized so much pain could now fit into an 8.5x11 envelope in my hand. But I didn't stop there. I made arrangements, legal ones, drafted notices, filed paperwork, secured protection, because I knew what was coming. You don't take back a kingdom without the old rulers throwing a fit. When I finally made the drive back to Maple Creek, spring was waking up the world. The trees were budding. The air had that clean after rain smell. But the house looked tired, faded, like it knew it had been abandoned emotionally long before it was left financially. I parked across the street and watched for a moment, then stepped out of the car. 2 officers waited for me on the sidewalk, calm, respectful, briefed ahead of time. And beside me, my lawyer, sharp-suited and sharp-tongued, holding a folder thick with the truth. We walked up the driveway together. I didn't knock. The officers did. The door opened. And there they were, my parents, older, smaller somehow, like their weight had been made of borrowed power all along. My mother gasped. My father's face darkened. "What is this?" he barked. "This," I said, holding up the folder, "is legal notice. I own this property now. The bank approved the transfer 2 weeks ago. You're trespassing." "You can't be serious." "I am," I said, steady. "And I'm done playing small." The officers stepped forward. It wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no handcuffs, just resistance melting into disbelief. As they packed bags and sputtered arguments, I said nothing. They asked where they were supposed to go. I didn't answer. I wasn't cold. I was done. When they were gone, I stepped over the threshold for the first time in 5 years. It smelled the same, a faint mix of lemon cleaner and dust. The hallway light flickered. The carpet hadn't changed, but I walked through each room in silence. The kitchen, the living room, the stairs that once creaked when I dared to sneak books past curfew. I opened the door to my old bedroom, empty now, stripped bare. I stood in the center of the room, closed my eyes, and breathed in. Not grief, not vengeance, closure. The first thing I did was change the locks, not because I thought they'd come back, though part of me knew they might try, but because there's something sacred about hearing that final click, knowing the only key that opens the door now belongs to you. I slept there that night. Not in a bed, those were gone, but on the hardwood floor of my old bedroom, wrapped in a blanket I brought from Detroit. The moonlight cut through the curtains, casting soft patterns on the walls. It looked like a child's room again, but the girl who once cried into her pillow here no longer lived in my skin. I was someone else now. I spent the weekend cleaning, not in anger, not in a rush, but like a ritual. I scrubbed the baseboards, aired out the closets, opened every window. Let the ghosts out gently. They didn't fight. I didn't keep the furniture. I donated what could be used. The rest I left on the curb with a sign, free to anyone starting over. Then slowly I started over too. I painted the living room a soft gray blue, tore up the stained carpet and let the wood beneath breathe again. Planted a few herbs on the porch, basil, rosemary, a single marigold just for her. And every evening I lit a candle in the kitchen and wrote. It was quiet, sometimes too quiet, but not lonely, never lonely. People asked if I was going to sell the house, move on, leave it behind now that I'd won. But this wasn't about winning. It was about reclaiming what had always been mine, not the walls or the deed or the land, but the right to exist here, fully, loudly, without apology. So I stayed, not forever, not trapped, just because I could. I turned the den into a small office for unspoken bloom. Put up a bulletin board filled with thank you notes, sticky drafts from mentees, and printouts of every book our imprint had helped bring into the world. When the first shipment of my book arrived, I placed the top copy on the mantel where my father's awards used to sit. And next to it, I set the velvet ring box, open, so the sapphires could catch the morning sun. Some days I still hear echoes of slammed doors, of muttered shame, of all the years I was told I wasn't enough. But they're only echoes. And the louder sound now, laughter from video calls with survivors who send me their first paragraphs, the click of keyboard keys at midnight, the rustle of pages being printed in the room where I was once silenced. And when people ask what justice looks like, I tell them this. It looks like a girl sitting cross-legged on the same floor she once collapsed on, sipping tea she bought herself with no one left to explain her piece to. It looks like healing, not the shiny kind, the quiet kind. The kind you build brick by brick, truth by truth, until your own voice is louder than anything they said about you. That's where my story ends. But yours. Yours might just be beginning. Did Clara's journey mirror something inside you? Have you reclaimed something, your voice, your space, your worth? Share your story in the comments. And if this series gave you strength, hit like, follow, and let's keep building stories that speak truth, even when others try to silence them. Until next time, take care of your peace. It's yours now.